and that we can start from the questions which we prepared for you in advance so that everyone can take part in polling, because journalists quite often ask us about fresh information about how business have adjusted to the new reality. And we have prepared 4 questions for you in order to get the fresh sentiments of yourselves. And I suggest that my colleagues plug in the first question, which means, are we back to the normal to the normal office work? So basically, are we back to office work? Katyusha, can you actually put on the screens the question which we like everyone to answer?
Yes, we are ready to start with the first question, so please vote.
So have you already returned to work in the office? Yes, yes, partially. No, not planned yet. So this will help to understand where we are in terms of the new reality. Are we working again distantly or remotely, or we are back to offices? How much time should we wait yet? Katya?
I offer you to start the conversation, and I will let you know when the question will be answered.
Good. Then I suggest that Tomasz, please, the floor is yours. So what are your lessons learned during this period of time? Have you adjusted your business model? And what are the most creative decisions you have taken during this time? Tomasz?
Yes, good morning. I'm here. Well, just to start, I mean, this crisis is already our 4th one in Ukraine after 98, 99, then 2008 to 2009 and 2014-15. It seems that this 4th crisis that we are going through is actually the easiest one. The previous ones have been more difficult. Despite the economic drop being quite sharp and unexpected, it is shallower than the economic drops in 2014-15, when the economy dropped almost 17%. Now we expect to be down about 7% this year and recover to about 4% growth next year. That, however, means that the economy will return back to its 2019 level only in 2020, by the end of 2022. If one compares this to the latest IMF expectation, that is actually quite optimistic. The IMF just recently, I think last week, published a little bit deeper correction this year by about 1 percentage point, about 8% GDP drop, and only 1% growth next year, and the economy returning to its pre-COVID size only in 23 or 24. So we're a little bit more optimistic here. So the correction will be a little bit shallower than the crisis 5-6 years ago. And we think that we will return to the pre-crisis size a little bit quicker than before. Second thing I want to say is that the economy is in much better shape going into this crisis than into the previous one. It's primarily thanks to very conservative fiscal and monetary policy. The fiscal policy allowed us to cut debt to GDP to around 50% going into the crisis, and we expect debt to GDP to peak at around 65-66% at the end of this year and stay at that level through next year before it starts coming down. So that's quite a comfortable level, and will allow Ukraine and companies in Ukraine to keep the cost of funding under control. As regards monetary policy, here one has to give a big credit to the central bank's work over the last 6 years. The banking system has been cleaned up of banks that have been doing not what one understands under classical banking. They have been doing different schemes, money laundering and related party loans. These banks are gone. The banking system has been quite profitable over the last 3 years and has substantial buffers to weather the crisis well. And we have seen that as opposed to previous crises, the population and companies have a great trust towards the banking sector and towards the central bank. You have had virtually no outflows of deposits. There was a small outflow of a few percent of retail deposits in March, but from April, all of this came back, and actually from May, we see growth in deposits, so they are now above the level from February even. The currency has been also very stable. The central bank has managed to keep it very stable through interventions in March, and then it is already year to date. It has bought more dollars than sold by, I guess, as of today, they have bought $1 billion or more than $1 billion more, and then they sold. Throughout this year. So the reserves are also at very comfortable level, and we expect them to continue to grow and the currency to remain stable throughout this year and next year around the current levels, maybe a small devaluation towards 28 or 29 at the end of next year. Also, what's very important for the currency is the current account deficit. That was very small last year. I mean, if you don't take into account the Naftogaz effect, I mean, the money that we got from Gazprom, it was less than 3% current account deficit last year. This year, we actually expect a current account surplus of 1%, because as you have seen in April, imports have corrected much stronger than exports. Initially, imports fell by almost 30% and exports only by 6%. That's due to the different structure of our exports. If you look at the crisis in 2008, at that time, agricultural commodities accounted only for about 12% of our exports. Now it's over 40% of our exports, and the demand for these commodities remains stable worldwide, and so do the prices. So that's also a strong plus. What are the risks to this relatively benign outlook? And then I'll say what we plan to do in terms of our investments. In terms of risks, we see the greatest potential for risks inside the country. I would call it self-inflicted mistakes or errors. We see recently attacks by the authorities versus the central bank. We think this is extremely dangerous, and any changes to the current legislation regulating the central bank activity or the banking sector would be extremely dangerous and would substantially undermine the economic stability and potential for further growth. The same is also, we see also attempts to undermine the hard created new corporate governance standards at a lot of the state-owned enterprises and state-owned banks, where independent boards have been put in place. Historically, all these companies have been milked by politicians who have been blocking their privatization. These companies have generated zero income for the government, and all of their profits have ended up in the pockets of vested interests. And in many cases, these companies have actually cost the budget a lot of money, like the state-owned banks, which have been recapitalized with billions of dollars over the last 12 years. So this has been not generating any income, or rather costs, extra costs to the budget. As EBA, we have discussed it at our last board meeting earlier this week, and are in the process of issuing statements in regard to central bank independence and corporate governance, because we see them as being extremely important, and we would very much want the government not to make these self-inflicted mistakes that come out of, I see two reasons for them. One is possibly some pre-local election populism, and lack of understanding. That comes to another weakness of the current setup that we see as a risk. That's the HR policy, which we see as having deteriorated since February. In February, early March, the government has changed, and the portfolios that deal with economy, finance, and reforms, I think, are now in weaker hands than they have been before. So we see these changes in government and authorities as negative since February. We have communicated it, or I have communicated publicly before, that this HR policy is a cause for concern. So these are the self-inflicted errors that come due to lack of, economic understanding in the current government team. The second thing is COVID. We see now around the world where these restrictions have been weakened, the growth in infection numbers. Thanks God, it's not leading to growth in death rates so far, and the capacity of the health system is now much stronger than it was back in March. So one can actually relatively safely relax some of these measures because we are more prepared and ready to react, and hopefully we will survive in this mode for the next 6, 7, 8 months until a vaccine is discovered and available in significant doses. I mean, there are progress by companies like Moderna and AstraZeneca that may have a vaccine by the year end already. And another risk, obviously, Russian behavior, economic and military, that obviously remains a risk, and dropping out of the IMF program would be also a big red light. As regards our activity or our business, we have come into the crisis relatively well prepared. We have not bought much last year, actually sold some assets last year, and because the asset prices grew over the last 4 years and some of the sellers have become quite greedy, we have been lucky not to have completed some transactions and went into the crisis with very little leverage, which has been always historically quite key to go into these crisis situations without leverage, because if you have a lot of leverage, a lot of debt, especially FX debt, then this crisis situation can really kill your business. What regards our plans for the future, we feel very comfortable with we feel quite comfortable with the external environment because of the unprecedented reaction by global central banks. I have actually expected the crisis to be much deeper, and the correction in global financial markets to be much deeper. I mean, if you look global financial markets, they have been correcting only 5 weeks. It was the shortest correction, and if you measure it by, for instance, S&P, then the market corrected only by about 35% from late February until March 23rd. So it was the shortest and much, I mean, the 35% correction. If you compare it to 2008, 2009, then the S&P index corrected by over 55%. Now it's only 35, despite a much deeper economic decline worldwide. I mean, then the world GDP was flat in 2008, 2009. Now world GDP, according to the latest IMF Outlook that came out yesterday, there will be a 5% GDP correction. But you
continue anyhow. But you know, Tomasz, you continue to buy anyhow. Just recently, we've heard that you have completed the purchase of another real estate object. So, what gives you optimism, or you are buying at the low prices?
Well, we bought. It was kind of a little coincidence. We have looked at this asset. It was being sold in an auction, and we were only one of the 2 participants in there, so it was at a relatively good price. So just to finish, so we bought a warehouse. We have a large portfolio of logistics real estate. We see good performance even despite the crisis in logistics. We have 11 warehouses, over 300,000 square meters. That's almost half of our total commercial real estate portfolio, which actually performs through the crisis surprisingly well. We were getting ready for a much worse performance, and we see now, for instance, the performance of the shopping malls, which have been hardest hit. They have been closed down. Now, since they have been reopened on May 11th, we see now the footfall, the traffic coming into these malls being to about 70% of the pre-crisis level, which is quite good because parts of the malls are not open, like the cinemas, and the food courts, and the turnover of the tenants is almost back to levels pre-crisis. So here, and you have seen it also in the consumer confidence numbers in May, which have recovered after a significant decline in March and April. So there are some green shoots. What I wanted to say is about just to finish about the global environment. We expect the global interest rates to be close to zero for many years. So we will have a very low interest global environment, which will be quite supportive for the restart of the global economy and also for emerging markets like Ukraine. But we are not going to make any large acquisitions this year until we are more comfortable with the government policies. Most likely we'll have to wait until the local elections are over and see whether this latest moves are just the pre-election populism or whether it's some more fundamental change. So we'll be watching the performance of the government if they don't drop out of the IMF program by the year end, and then perhaps increase our investments next year or at the end of this year. But for the next 3-4 months, we'll be observing the behavior of our authorities, and especially these actions versus the central bank that makes us extremely nervous.
Good.
And also
let us give some time, Tomasz, because otherwise we can actually complete the whole 1 hour. And let's give some time to our other speakers. But just to give also the feeling that we have already released both statements on the National Bank of Ukraine and also on the state-owned enterprises. And thank you to media because they made them really widely spread. And I hope that this message will come through to the decision makers in Ukraine. And if time will allow, I will ask you then about recommendations which you can give to businessmen in order to be better prepared, but only if time allows. And let me also pass the floor to Josta Lungman before you are taking the floor. Katya, have you already results of the first question?
Yes, here we go. Do you see them?
Yes, 40% yes, partially, and 25% no, not planning yet 7%, and yes, only 28%. And let's launch another question. The other question is asking about resumption of your operational activities. Have you done it yet? So Katya, please show it to our audience. During the last months of adoptive quarantine, have you managed to resume your business operation? Yes, partially, no. So while we are collecting responses, Josta, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. So next time around, I'm going to request to speak before Thomas because he was saying almost all of the things that I was planning to say.
You will then need to be the president of the EBA, Josta.
Okay. Yes, but I can echo what Thomas said. That this is really a massive challenge, not only for Ukraine but also for the world. And as Thomas said yesterday, we revised our global outlook, and we see a larger contraction in the world economy than we previously did. Now we're projecting a contraction of almost 5% in the global economy in 2020. Ukraine is hit bad by this shock, but in some sense much in line with other neighboring countries, much in line with European countries. So our projection is indeed a little bit worse than other forecasters. We project a contraction this year of about 8%. And this is a combination of a drop in domestic demand, and across the board. Sectors that are hit particularly bad is manufacturing and retail and transport sectors, but we see it across the board, and this is combined with a weaker external environment. We do see some recovery in 2021, but by the end of 2021, Ukrainian GDP is still going to be about 6% below the end 2019 GDP. And we're not going to get back to the pre-crisis GDP until 2024. But also, I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty here, and usually as economists we have some experience in predicting financial developments and economic developments, but so much here depends on the development of this virus, and therefore it's very difficult to know what's going to happen. And I mean, it looks like we're not going to have clarity until there's clarity on a vaccine. So let me move then to more Ukraine specific and policies in Ukraine. And I think it's worthwhile to separate Ukrainian policies into a short-term policies and more medium-term policies. And we are being mindful of both of these perspectives in the IMF supported program. So in the short term, I mean, the number one focus is to be able to manage the health impact of this crisis and make sure that there is a healthcare system that can that's adequately resourced to take care of people, and to make sure that there are protective equipment and preparedness to avoid people suffering from this. The budget, the revised budget has allocated about 1.5% of GDP to healthcare, including increases in or top-ups of wages to doctors. But as you've seen, the overall expansion in the fiscal deficit has gone from about 2% of GDP to 8% of GDP. And the big factor there is the automatic stabilizers. So just the drop in tax collections due to the slowdown of the economy and due to increased unemployment benefits. But there is also a policy of supporting households, the loss of income of households, and support business, and primarily small and medium-sized business. On the household side, the support package is about 1.3% of GDP, so it's a big support. If we look at an international comparison, I mean, Ukraine is somewhere in the middle in terms of the support that is providing to its economy in this crisis, and is limited basically by the fiscal space and in its ability to support the economy. One aspect that we are highlighting in the program is to ensure that there is transparency in all the public procurement related to the COVID-19 crisis, to make sure that procurement documents are available for public scrutiny, and particularly that there is information about the ultimate beneficiary owners of the companies that participate in public procurement, and also that there is a thorough ex-post audit of all the expenditure that takes place, and that this is also done in consultation with third-party auditors. On the NBU side, there the focus is to provide or to make sure that the financial system has liquidity and that it can support lending to help the economy, but also being mindful that this should not come at the expense of overall financial stability. And a third short-term focus is if not to advance structural reforms, is to preserve the hard-earned gains in structural reforms that Ukraine has made over the past 5 years. Thomas mentioned the corporate governance reforms and the independence of the central bank, and it is indeed important that these are preserved because they are very much in Ukraine's long-term interest. But turning to the longer term, so in the program, our aim is that when we come out of this crisis, Ukraine should be able to pick up where it was before the crisis and advance important structural reforms that are necessary for the long-term health of the Ukrainian economy. And that means advancing reforms such as anti-corruption, privatization, revenue administration, continue to build a sound financial sector, land reform, energy sector reforms. And if Ukraine had a large expansion of the fiscal deficit that in many ways is justified, it's going to be important for Ukraine to go back to more moderate fiscal policies after the crisis. So to go back to primary deficit, or to go back to primary surpluses, and deficits of around 1.5–2% of GDP, with the aim to bring debt back to levels of less than 50% of GDP. And for this, it's going to be necessary to broaden tax bases, to improve the collection and the administration of yes, can you hear me?
For this,
Am I the only one?
Just, I guess you can continue and Anna will connect soon.
Yeah, it looks like it's Anna was the only one. I was about to wrap up, and just by saying that I mean, the point I want to make is that the fiscal policy is going to have to adjust once we get out of the crisis to get things back, and that is going to require a big effort, and that's also something that we foresee in the program.
Josta, yes, thank you very much.
yes, I see. By the way, we have my energy has come back, so I'm ready to ask the question. Why is Josta forecasting Ukraine GDP drop worse than global outlook? This is the question from audience.
So one factor why Ukraine's GDP is going to drop, or two factors why Ukraine is going to drop more than other countries. Number one, Ukrainian firms and Ukrainian households don't have the same buffers that have in other countries. So the contraction when is or the consumption drops more when people cannot tap into these buffers. The other is that Ukraine cannot utilize the same type of fiscal support for the economy due to limited fiscal space.
Understandable. So, but do you really think that the government of Ukraine will suspend reforming and it will still allow receive us your support, or it will be somehow in different ways. So the government will not continue reforming and we will not continue getting your support.
I don't want to speculate on that. I mean, we have just approved the program where the Ukrainian authorities, so the government, the MBU, and the president, they have committed. They put their signatures on a program which has some focused reforms. So I mean, our expectations is that those commitments will be honored.
That's good to hear, and let's hope that our government will indeed actually continue to listen and to get your voice and also the business community voice, because it's now our sentiment is that it has become worse and it has become more difficult to actually to make our operations running, and especially when the government is not ready to continue the regulation processes and reduction of pressure from state institutions to the work of business. So it's difficult so far. It's so far the challenge. It's our overall opinion, and we will actually share this opinion next week with the whole community here in Ukraine. Thank you, Josta. Let's move on. I suggest that Alexander Pisaruk jumps in and let us know what kind of adjustments have you done in your business, in banking sector. Will it survive? I mean, the banking sector, this crisis, and what to expect actually, both this summer and autumn and next year.
Thank you very much for the question. I mean, the quick answer to your question: will the banking sector survive? Yes, for sure. I mean, as Tomasz already mentioned, the banking sector in Ukraine went into this crisis in the best shape ever in its Ukrainian history. So that's largely due to the excellent work of the National Bank of Ukraine on cleaning the banking sector over the last 5 to 6 years. So banks generally have sufficient capital and liquidity buffers. Liquidity is particularly abundant, so the banks are willing and actually ready to support the economy with credit in a reasonable way. So there will definitely, I don't see any probability of banking defaults, especially not in the large systemic banks. So the financial stability is well preserved. That's the good news for everybody in this country, I guess. So the banking sector was the source of a problem globally and also in Ukraine in the previous crisis, but now it's rather the part of the solution to the problem, not the problem itself. Banks are also, and that's important, not only financially stable and able to weather the crisis and the storm, but they actually were able to operationally adjust very quickly. So, you know, pretty much all major banks in Ukraine switched to remote methods of work early on in the crisis. To give you an example of Raiffeisen, we basically switched the bank with 7,500 people workforce to remote work within 2 weeks. That wasn't necessarily all easy, but we did this. So did other major banks. And the reason for this probably is because digitalization was the trend in banking for more than 10 years. So banks have been working to a different extent on the digitalization of their processes, channels, working the client through remotely. So what crisis did to all of us is actually accelerated this trend, digitalization trend, but it didn't catch most of the leading banks in Ukraine off guard. So we were kind of prepared. So that actually explains that operationally things went smoothly. So the clients and the banks adjusted, and I don't envisage any problems in this respect going forward. Actually, the lessons from banking probably are relevant to other industries as well. I think going forward with the coronavirus or any other virus that may expect in the future, second wave, third wave, or any mutated virus, I think increases the need for all the companies in all industry sectors to be prepared to work both remotely and offline and online. So essentially, the readiness to work in both regimes should be excellent. each individual company would need to find the optimal mix of online and offline work, depending on the sector and depending on the real situation with the virus or crisis. So, and to be able to switch gears quickly between these methods of work. These are, I think, becoming the lessons from this particular crisis. I think banks, including Raiffeisen, learned those lessons. So we are very comfortable working now remotely. I mean, to give you again another example, in March, April, we basically temporarily closed 71 of our 450 branches in the cities for 2 months. And then we also switched to 3 days regime in all rural branches, 226. So basically 2 days a week, 300 out of 450 branches of Raiffeisen were closed temporarily. So, and we serve the clients. So that's a good example. So banking is one of those industries which is well prepared operationally, or relatively well prepared. But again, some industries we need to catch up a bit more in this respect. Yeah.
But do you think this combination of work, both remote work and office working, will continue to be forever, or will come back in certain time to normal reality? I mean, working in office.
Actually, it's a good question for everybody. I guess the answer I give for Raiffeisen and probably for most of the banks, we will never get back, all of us, to the office, right? So that is a thing of the past. So on the branches, operational branches, people mostly go back to work, but in the head office, in the product teams, those people who don't directly deal with the clients, we will never go back to fully office work. So to give you an example, we now put in place the plan of gradual return to work in 4 stages. Very carefully, very slowly in some sense. We don't rush to go back to the office. On the regional stage, we basically no more than 25% of our head office staff goes back to work. Then it will be 35, 50, and then eventually probably 60%. But we will never go back to 100 or 80%, right? And actually our near-term target is to reduce the office work to at least 50%. That is our new normal. I'm sure this is not only for Raiffeisen, for many other banks and companies.
For everybody.
There's no old pre-crisis past.
That's right, because it looks like that the labor market has changed dramatically. And as one of the businessmen also told some time ago, that nowadays we are paying not for time of the employee, but for the result gained. So basically this new reality really focuses us and really makes us to focus on getting results done.
Interesting, but there's one more remark I want to make. We all sort of embraced enthusiastically or online methods of work, but let's be realistic. We also learned that people are social creatures, right? We like to see each other, meet with each other. The first board meeting, management board meeting in Raiffeisen we had 2 weeks ago, we were extremely happy to see each other. So actually, and some of the topics and some of the meetings, particularly strategic meetings, difficult discussions, topics for discussion, or where meetings where you really need to collect proper feedback, those are better held still offline, physically. I mean, that is
You're absolutely right. You are absolutely right. And I can also agree with this statement, because after all, offline, you are resolving things much quicker compared to online. Correct. And also, as with one of the European colleagues, we were talking about how to meet offline or online. And the guy said, you know, better meet offline, because the connection online does not give you the whole diving into the process. So basically, sometimes you're losing attention of the person who is actually listening you online. Exactly. So that is why combination will be probably indeed actually the new reality. But nevertheless, it's necessary to adjust on that. Let's move on. Let's listen to another panelist, Anдрій Горохов, UMG. Andriy, what kind of sentiments you have and expectations, and what kind of businesses suffer the most? And what are the industries in your portfolio which feel better? By the way, before you plug in, I suggest that we actually listen to the results of the second question with regards to resumption of the operational activities. And now we see that, yes, majority have resumed it, 47%, and the rest, you see actually the numbers. And let's launch the third question, which is connected to staff. What kind of plans do you have regarding staff retention or increase or decrease? It will be also interesting to get the trend actually in place by getting your responses. So let's answer the poll. And Andreyu, the floor is yours. Anдрій Горохов, unmute, please.
Yeah, now I'm on. Thank you, Anna. Well, first of all, I would like to thank Alexander for nice description of banking system, and it's really good that for the businesses that and for the whole economy that financial system is stable. At the same time, all bankers, including Alexander, possibly know that economy lacks liquidity, and commercial enterprises these days too. And in all businesses which we do have in our portfolio, we see that our clients in Ukraine, in particular, are asking for different payment terms. They want more credit time than before. And the reasonable explanation is that they lack liquidity, they lack working capital for their operations because banks cut off financing partially. In terms of our outlook, we are present, we have invested in 11 companies, and through them, we see all major industries in Ukraine, and we sell to 40 markets worldwide. So get sentiments out of them pretty clearly. If we look at Ukrainian economy first and our industries, for understandable reasons, we see a drop in all of them during last 3 months. But if we gonna forecast what could happen during 12 months, we see that relatively agriculture in Ukraine is supposed to feel well, and in money terms, they're gonna match level of previous year, and individually, at company level, financial results are supposed to be much better than in previous year because Forex is positive, and in terms of costs relating to fuel and fertilizers, for example, they are down. That is why input into Ukrainian GDP of agriculture is supposed to be positive this year. In terms of fertilizers, for example, which is also a big industry in Ukraine, we see that in money terms, they most probably will fall up to 30–40%. It depends on prices for fertilizers, which are down because gas price is down, and which is the major component of production for fertilizer. And also we see that there won't be any limitations in terms of import, for example, from Russia and Belarus. Russia is the main supplier, which will be very beneficial for agriculture in terms of costs, but will damage one way or another production of Ukrainian fertilizers. That is why 30% drop in money terms we forecast for year 2020. Steel industry, which is major in Ukraine. For 2020, we forecast in money terms around 10% drop because prices slightly improved recently, but still at low levels. The volumes are improving, but there was a significant drop before. And 10% for a major industry down money terms most probably gets those -8 or 6%, depending on forecast in Ukrainian GDP drop, well, a significant portion of that. We see that Far East, in particular China, feels more or less well when there was a question relating to global economy drop in GDP. It's 4.9% forecasted for 2020. We understand that it's weighted average. And in some countries like US or Ukraine, we have forecast -8% GDP, but in China, for example, it's +1. So China is consuming, and which is very good for our agriculture and our extraction industries like iron ore. So we expect that money terms iron ore industry would be at the same level as in previous year, slightly higher in volumes and slightly less in money terms. In terms of energy market, we all know that there is a severe situation, and it seemed previously as that renewables managed to reach some sort of a deal, some sort of a rough compromise, but recent news from Ukrenergo and change of tariffs increasing 4 times get back to a crisis mode, and if that continues, we would have a serious impact in terms of costs for all enterprises, all industries in Ukraine. And we'll see how it goes further. And certainly it could influence and impact severely the drop in GDP, which is forecasted these days. In terms of railway logistics, we see that there is a drop around 50%, and we forecast a drop of 50% money terms, because volumes decrease of transportation, plus the price for railway cars, for leasing railway cars also decreased immensely, 2-3 times these days. So we think that they will improve slightly, but still remain at 50% of previous year. In terms of construction is down. Apart from construction of railroads, where budget has given around 3 billion for 2020, and construction of roads goes on, hopefully, and that helps Ukrainian economy to stay at reasonably good level. At least that segment of construction industry consumes something. Well, that's in terms of general outlook. Certainly at all markets where we sell, we see a drop in volumes, in some drop in prices. European markets were closed for several months, and even when they opened, they still are not that sure in terms of their distribution networks, because they are partially disrupted. And that's a level of uncertainty which we get when we talk to them, because they don't know how much they need and what kind of future could be forecasted for their businesses. That's why they buy and consume and produce at very cautious low levels, and that impacts like our businesses. On average, in our portfolio, we have some businesses which improved their performance and some decreased like 50%. Average drop, I would say, in financial terms, around 20%, which again, as Tomasz said, for his portfolio, we expected worse. But what we get now seems to be reasonable and fine. In terms of a team, we pleasantly were surprised how strong and united team is, and that is why when all conventional wisdom teaches us to invest in people and in team building, well, it's time when it pays back well, and because of a team and creative approaches and very proactive attitude towards business opportunities and risks which arise, we get to decent numbers and good financial performance. We don't have
by the way, Andrei, what are the most creative decisions and ideas have been released?
Well, first of all, in all corporate structures, there are like strategies which are approved by supervisory boards and etc., which is nice, certainly, and very important. But these days we agreed on that we could easily convert strategy anyhow, and there is a short distance to decision makers, and we're ready to work 24 hours a day if it's needed to change something. So basically, there are no rules which couldn't be changed, apart from values of a company and apart from being united and being proactive. So basically, all soft stuff remains, but hard stuff could be changed any second if we see that a gain could come. In terms of investment activity, we invest certainly more cautiously than before. looking at targets and completing some deals which we've made, agreements which we've made previous year, but this year they are supposed to be closed. In this respect, we're pretty active on the market and planning to be. But again, it will depend on level of activity of Ukrainian and international banks, whether they would provide liquidity and debt for partially for some of M&A activity or not, and for sentiments of consumers worldwide, including Ukraine, because you understand it impacts a lot valuation and company's performance. Thank you.
But do you feel, being a national producer, do you feel some special attention to you from the government, some support? Because, you know, rumors have it that Akhmetov business receives substantial support from the government and the government of Ukraine. Can you confirm that?
Well, what I know, for example, if we compare Ukraine to China, that China up till now helped its businesses up to $1 trillion US, and they provide substantial loan facilities from 0.5% to 2%, which is very beneficial, and they're planning to support. In terms of Ukrainian government, as far as I understand, they do what they can at the moment, and they don't have a lot of resources shared with the business, so they done something. Tomasz has mentioned that there are some mistakes, unfortunately, taking place, which makes the situation even worse than it could be. And well, that's the case. That's Ukrainian reality. But I hope that with the help of institutions such as EBA, for example, wisdom will prevail and mistakes won't take place.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Andrei. Before moving to Vasily, I suggest that we see the results of the third question, which is staff retention prevails 60%, staff downsizing only 28%, and staff growth 13%. But still, staff growth is also available. And the last question is regarding salaries. Katya, please show it to the audience so that we can get also fresh results. What is your company's salary policy for the next 6 months? Salary preservation, reduction, or increase? Let's move to Vasily while collecting responses. Vasily, what have you done differently during these 3 months? And do you think that you will be able to adjust to the new reality?
Thank you, Anya. As you know, I have a big number of pink glasses in my deck, so I'm just changing them from time to time. That's why I'm remain optimistic. But nevertheless, it's obvious that post-pandemic business would not longer be the same. But we do not consider this as a crisis. It is our new normal, so we have to adapt. The changes come faster and they're less predictable, so we have to be agile to sustain and keep on going further. We prefer to consider this period as an opportunity to become better, more flexible, creative, effective, and fast. Such approach leads us to a new solutions. As an example, I will give you that our recent start of collaboration with Zoko petrol stations, which are now becoming look like a retail stores and attracting more and more customers and consumers. Of course, there are a number of key focuses for us as an international business that will help us in the future to be prepared for such crisis situation. It's further production localization, development of more lean and responsive supply chain, rapid e-com transformation, agile 360 degrees approach, and Scrum concept, which we already have been successfully implementing for a number of years. And that's why we didn't have any problems, any troubles with the transferring to work work from home immediately after the quarantine in Ukraine has been introduced. And of course, post-coronavirus thinking requires significant change in communication. So here transformation are inevitable. We clearly understand that due to new reality, purpose of brands has to become even more significant because everything depends on people's health and well-being, planet sustainability, and responsible use of resources. The new reality we are facing requires specific changes and transformation, and factors which we consider become significant. It's first of all, it's change management as everyday modus operandi, needing short-term planning, different investment strategy, and speed and flexibility. All above mentioned factors were taken into consideration to change planning approach with a higher focus on short and medium-term goals to ensure sustainability of supply chain, enhancing close cooperation with the partners and customers to improve quality and speed of collaboration, responding on fast-changing market conditions. As globally responsible business, we are always ready to provide with the help and support to the local communities. So, since the beginning of COVID pandemic, Unilever Ukraine conducted its donations of disinfection, hygiene, and the food products to core infection hospitals in all regions of Ukraine. With the help of global and local non-government organizations, disinfectants and tea has been provided to the most vulnerable categories of population of Ukraine. Unilever has joined to the initiative of UNICEF and Ministry of Education of Ukraine and provided 28,000 liters of domestos to ensure safety measures during the exams all around Ukraine. So total amount of donations already reached 3 million Ukrainian hryvnias. And during the time of these major challenges, we had faced overloading of supply chain and stock issues due to sharp increased demand on sanitizers and hygiene products, and as well as limited ability of sales teams to visit stores. But in shortest possible time, we had managed to adjust our structure and procedures to supply Ukrainian consumers with the strategically important products, such as domestos disinfectants, Dove and Silky Hands soaps, and other hygiene products. By the way,
So Vasily, have you received higher results on profitability because of domestos and disinfectors? You are making more money.
Yeah, I would say, we have very diverse portfolio. Therefore, we got, I would say, better turnover with some of other brands and categories, but at the same time, some of our products and categories were quite, I would say, severely affected by the decrease of demand. So, for example, deodorants and hair categories, they are facing market decline. That's why
people are sitting home, so there is no need to deodorant.
Yeah, I can understand them, if we will talk about shampoos, but nevertheless. So coming back to positive news, so we receive the results from United States Microbiome Laboratories, which proves that its preliminary results, we received them in May, that our domestos kills COVID-19 on surfaces. So, there are more positive news. Another challenge was to transform activities and events in online format. I will give you an example. Instead of offline activities of sponsorship with football club Shakhtar and sponsorship of traditional running marathons by our brand Rexona, our team created alternative way of online activities. Shakhtar football players, along with their families, as well as the athletes of Run Ukraine, conducted online trainings for Ukrainians on social networks. Also, we supported the sport trainers who have temporarily lost their income during the quarantine by involving them into the online training of Ukrainians in our social networks. Our employees are the most valuable resources of our company. That's why importance of support of every single employee is crucial. That is why we organized daily management team and functional catch-ups, products delivery to every employee's house, and professional psychological support for those who requires. As a new good tradition,
how many people have required, Vasily, how many people have required psychological help?
To be honest, you know, I don't have such statistics, you know. I would like to testify that I don't. I have my wife who always help me, you know, with this kind of stuff. So, as I already mentioned, we introduced a new good tradition. Every Monday morning we start with video call of entire company with cup of lifting tea, sharing good mood, positive energy, latest company news, interesting tips of work from home, and anything people would like to share. So starting from March, we actually, end of March, we, as I already mentioned, we had a quite negative impact on sales in several of our categories. But
People
we
are
have
asking
quite well balanced.
which of the segments, which of the product segments will face maximum impact from COVID?
It is actually the deodorants and the cosmetics products.
Thank you.
That's based on our experience. As already mentioned, we have quite well-balanced portfolio. That's why to cope with viruses and take care of health and hygiene. And the increased consumer concern about cleanliness and immunity strengthening is a growing trend. Health and well-being mega trends become even more prominent. So according to Nielsen, we see that the first quarantine stage was accompanied by panic purchases and stockpiling of products such as soap. It was plus 56%, bleaches plus 312%, and toilet cleaners plus 77%. The shutdown of a number of industries lead to increase of unemployment and the decrease of consumer purchasing power and overall consumption decline. We expected that value for money segment of the market will be growing this year. So consumer demand is gradually returning, and we observe with the relief of quarantine measures. That's what we observe, but still significantly behind of pre-quarantine level. Transition to new normal leads to consumer habits, to the change of consumer habits and appearing new consumer habits. In particular, it's online shopping. The people realize that there are advantages in saving the time and contactless purchase. This habit will continue to grow. Another habit is personal hygiene. People get used to wash their hands more often and use disinfectants. We forecast these habits will remain. Actually, we hope that the situation with adaptation of life in conditions of coronavirus will stabilize step by the end of 2020. And we consider the safety of our employees and their family as well as our partners.
How do you expect stabilization? What does it mean, stabilization?
It means that basically, first of all, the number of infected people will be gradually decreasing. And another thing that people will develop new, I would say, neural connections, which will help them to, you know, to live within the current situation with high level of, I would say, unpredictability.
Confidence. Good.
Absolutely.
Let's see. So, thank you, Vasily. Yeah. I suggest that we actually move on anyhow because we have Dmitro yet, Shalomka, in order to complete the session. And we have a few questions probably to everyone regarding bankruptcies, because people are asking what are the results restructuring and massive bankruptcies by the end of the 2020. But let's see. Let's see the results of the fourth question, which we have. Salary preservation, vast majority would like to preserve salaries. Reduction is 21% and increase only 9%. Okay, and now let's move to the digital guy, Dmitro Shalomka, Google.
Before you do, Anna,
yeah,
can I be released? I'm already late for another meeting.
Good, thank you very much, Josta.
Yeah, thank you. All the best. See you soon, I hope.
See you soon.
Yeah, bye.
Yeah, bye.
Okay, so do you hear me right now?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Talking about digital and e-commerce, I see like from the very beginning of this event, these words were flying around actually. So I'm ready actually to comment on many things about this. So as you can imagine, any crisis for emerging markets, for countries like Ukraine, usually fuels e-commerce development and usually fuels internet development, because, well, companies that were preferring traditional channels of distribution, traditional channels of promotions, during this particular crisis were extremely limited in promoting themselves and actually delivering goods. And if you remember, even like for big chains, for grocery chains, at the beginning of our lockdown in Ukraine, it was like some breaks in delivery, some problems, some overload. But I would say that most of companies who were experiencing these troubles build up capacities and really organized their activities pretty well, so things become much better. So talking about digital in general, as you can imagine, most companies that were balancing between offline and online activities and were using all channels of promo and distribution were forced to move to digital. So you can imagine that e-commerce is booming in Ukraine because of this right now. So I can tell you, like, I never can give you absolute numbers, unfortunately, you know it, but I can give you relative numbers, the growth numbers. So if Ukrainian e-commerce was growing last year in line with like economy and the average growth of retail, of big retailers on the internet in terms of promos, which means in terms of volumes as well, we're not actually peaking 20-24%. During the last 2 months, they're growing in triple digits. So the average growth of e-commerce, of retail, and it's actually, I'm talking about general picture of, like, name any company, all companies, you know, all famous big companies that do shopping, online shopping, of appliances, of cosmetics, of groceries, of like, I don't know, construction materials, everything. They're growing in Ukraine, they're growing like 270% year-over-year in the last 3 months. Another sector of growth is actually professional services and B2B solutions related to automation of work, like remote work. We are using Zoom right now. Not many people use Zoom before the pandemic. Now Zoom is one of the biggest companies and one of the fastest growing companies on stock markets and actually in the world. So and they had to invest a lot to actually to keep up this situation and keep up with the situation and deliver the quality of the services. So there are a couple of clients like this actually also are growing, and some of companies are in Ukraine that actually technology companies that do this work and are pretty successful. Of course, if you're talking about e-commerce, the sectors that dropped dead is travel, and a lot of companies that actually were working in online on booking travels, on arranging travels, on tours are now just stopped. But it happened for some short period of time between April and May, and the end of May shows that when world reopens, demand for travel services again on the rise. So this sector can rebound quite quickly, quicker than people expect. This is actually talking about like portfolio of large clients dependent on internet solutions. Talking about SMB business, we saw Google is pretty good representation of activities of SMBs in internet in general. Well, majority of companies are retail, but there are other sectors, including events, including some travel companies, including production, professional services, finance, etc. There was quick decline. So April was, for the first time in many years, April was negative, demonstrating negative growth for SMBs in internet and e-commerce. But again, it quickly recovered. It really quickly recovered. And now what I see from general market results, the growth of market, of e-commerce market for SMBs is on the same level as was before the crisis, on a February level. And February, well, in Ukraine, February is, let's say, pretty active economic months often. Not that active as September, October, November, but still pretty well economic. So we can actually measure and state that in Ukrainian internet, in Ukrainian online commerce, things got back to normal pretty fast, and it's happening now. So it's not going to change. With the situation right now in Ukraine, when we have major uncertainty about future of COVID and how these limits will be imposed on Ukrainian society and how actually Ukrainians will travel, which is also important, I don't really see that environment will be changing. So e-commerce will be fueled by this crisis and continue to grow. So this is actually the industry where everyone wants really to be right now. So that's it. Actually, I think that this is from me for now. And if you have any questions, let's talk about it.
Good, thank you. And have you seen also the change of habits of people? Because you're also detecting the trends, what people are looking for. And have you changed? Have they changed their preferences?
It's a very good question. Thank you very much. It's very important. So we actually have two reports that are available for everyone. And if anyone is interested, they can go and check it out on the internet. One is mobility report, which actually shows dynamics of how people spend their time and where, and how it's changed in the last 6 months. So in Ukraine has pretty drastic changes in people behavior. You can check it out. It's available. Just search for Google mobility report. It's available for Ukraine since last 4 weeks or some time already. So there is an archive. Another one is Google Trends. And trends actually also important, and there is a special COVID report for every country, including Ukraine as well, so you can actually see it. It's public information about how people changed the habits. Of course, I confirm what Vasily said. There was a panic demand for various services at the beginning. Now it's again going back quickly, a little bit to normal. This is very important to say. So in terms of actually how people will be behaving right now, you can imagine that until there is no, we will not go back to the way how we lived in February and before in the next foreseeable future, in a couple of quarters, let's say it like this. Some companies are not opening offices yet, like ours, for example. Google is working from home in Ukraine until we don't know when. Many companies like this, American companies especially, will continue doing the same. This is actually how this is more or less legal and safety requirement right now. So people will not go back to the office. Habits of people will be changed, and they will actually use the demand for actually arranging workspace at home and more quality time at home will be here.
We even heard that it seems to me it was Google who is going to invest $1,000 per installation of each working place at home, but in certain countries that was the rumors.
For us as well too. So I bought myself a chair, and I still have some money to spend. Actually, I don't know. Yeah, I have no. Some people from my team relocated to Ukrainian countryside. They can buy real estate and a lot of land for this money. So we're still considering how to arrange it. But yeah, it's true. So Google supports this notion. I think many companies are also doing the same.
You see, interesting. Thank you so much. By the way, while Vasily was talking, Bielotserkivskoye Industrial Park was inviting you actually to visit their place because they were happy to listen that you are going to localize your production at maximum pace. So you see, some sort of connections could be also arranged during such kind of meetings, even online, although I do miss actually our offline gatherings. And also question to all, probably it's more to Tomasz and Alexander most likely. What kind of do you expect growth of bankruptcies in Ukraine? And if yes, in which sectors?
Okay, could I start, Anna, probably
yes.
as a banker? So we, as you know, Raiffeisen is one of the largest creditors in the Ukrainian economy. So we see many clients, both large corporates, small, medium enterprises, and private individuals. So. And from what we see, at least, we don't see a large number of bankruptcies in front of us, at least not in the corporate sector. It's probably because Raiffeisen's client base is a good quality client base. So it's actually improved compared to the previous waves of crisis in 2014, 15, and 2008. So we have a very good clients, but we see them being fairly resilient as well. So we don't see that much. What we could expect that it may be more visibility on the difficulties in October, September, as closer to the fourth quarter of the year, simply because the recession takes toll on businesses gradually. So there may be more difficulties the companies will experience closer to the fall. So we'll see, but at the moment we don't see it. So relatively more difficulties we see in the private individual, basically, who are borrowers, the consumer loans portfolio, this type of stuff, which is actually a reflection of what the National Bank of Ukraine was saying. So they were actually warning banks and everybody that the growth of consumer lending was too fast for some time. And that now shows that the consumer lending is an area where actually we expect a little bit more problems. Not excessive ones, nothing comparable to the previous crisis, but relatively more than in the corporate sector. That's at least what we see.
Yeah, good, thank you. Are you on the same page, Tomasz?
Yes, I'm on the same page. Obviously, Alexandros is a little bit wider than we do. We expect the growth in NPLs in the banking sector, obviously, but nowhere at the level where it was in the previous crisis. And I also confirm that, yeah, we've looked at opportunities in the banking sector with particular focus on consumer loans, and so understand the situation quite well. So we expect there the amount of non-performing loans to grow quite substantially, but it will become visible over time because the central bank has given some leeway to banks to create reserves, and there are certain credit holidays that have been provided to the borrowers. So we see that the loans that are coming out of the credit holidays or will be coming out of the credit holidays throughout the summer or in the fall, that the level of defaults will increase quite a bit versus the previous period. But it's not going to be nowhere as dramatic as it was in 2014-15, especially because also the hit to the currency is very insignificant.
Anna,
At least so
if
far.
I may.
Yes, sure.
I go along with Tomasz in terms of forecast, but I believe it will highly depend on what will be happening in the world in fall and later on, because if there be an additional impact, then situation could drastically change. What we see at the moment that there are several institutions raising fund not for NPLs, but for bridge financing, which actually is an instrument to cover cash deficit, temporary cash deficit, where like business model works well, but since banks limit debt facilities and they need cash for working capital to operate their working business model, they need some assistance. So there are a couple of institutions raising funds from 10 to 50 mil, which is not significant, but still. But then we'll see in terms of future and how world economy will impact Ukrainian context later in the fall. Thank you.
Thank you, Andriy. So, ladies and gentlemen, I understand that we have a number of questions in the chat, and what I suggest that in order not to extend this session, I suggest that we can send relevant questions to relevant panelists, and I suggest that our panelists give responses in case it's possible to authors of questions already after the meeting, and we will submit those responses to relevant parties. Okay, thank you so much. It was interesting to hear you, and let's hope that indeed crisis will not be that deep as we all imagine. Let's hope that it will the way out would be softer than that we probably think. And let me wish everyone to stay strong, healthy, both in terms of business and in terms of personalities. And let's hope that our new habits will help us to adjust to the new reality, which will never be the same as it was before crisis. Thank you to everyone, and till new meetings. Good luck.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.